Our breaking news, former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn is willing to testify before federal and congressional investigators, but only if he is granted immunity. That's according to his lawyer. Joining me now, CNN's David Gergen, Nia Malika Henderson, also CNN political commentator Matt Lewis, legal analyst Laura Coates, historian Jon Meacham, author of American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House, and CNN national security analyst Juliette Kayyem. Good evening. Juliette, fitting to start with you because the Wall Street Journal they were the first ones to report that General Flynn is willing to be interviewed in exchange for immunity. This is something that you thought that we might see. In fact, you said it on this very show on Friday night. Juliette?
Oh, yeah, that's right, Don. That's right. I think we were leading to this moment, and the clues were there. It's just sort of putting them all together. They begin with how Flynn was fired. Remember that Sally Yates had warned the White House, the head of the Department of Justice at the time, had warned the White House that he could be compromised. The White House held on to him for several weeks, suggesting Flynn knew a lot. We then don't, once he gets fired, we don't hear from him. And yet we hear from Manafort, Carter Page, and Roger Stone, the other, of the four that we always talk about. The other three were quite public. That began to then suggest that Flynn might be on his own and looking for a deal. There were other hints over the course of the last couple of weeks, including, of course, last Friday when two stories came out, and in the strange world of 2017, forgive me for quoting the National Enquirer, but it is a pro-Trump publication. Now, National Enquirer had a story throwing Flynn under the bus, and by the end of Friday, the Wall Street Journal had a story that suggested that Flynn was doing very bad things regarding Turkish citizens and the possibility that a Turkish citizen would be sent back to Turkey. Right. All of those clues together made me think that there's a bigger story here, which is Flynn wants a deal. And we don't know what the nature of that deal is or what he's proffering, but certainly there's just no way to think.
You were essentially reading the tea leaves, having done this before, and I think that's what you said. Having done this before, what is interesting is that you have not heard from General Michael Flynn and generally what that means. I understood what you were saying when you said that, but I want to bring Laura, I want to bring other folks in here. Laura, and Flynn's attorney is saying, this is part of, he said, General Flynn certainly has a story to tell should the circumstances permit. The letter then goes on to say, no reasonable person who has a benefit of advice from counsel would submit to questioning in such a highly politicized witch hunt environment without assurances against unfair prosecution. Flynn's attorney isn't using legal jargon here, but when you read that, what are you thinking?
I read that and say you are asking for immunity. And of course, the issue is not why you'd request immunity. Of course, if you're going to be presented with a criminal investigation, and you've already heard the FBI director say there is a criminal investigation into whether or not people in the Trump campaign, to which he was a part of, were involved in collusion. You have that. You also have the Logan Act allegations that he may have represented the United States in a way he wasn't supposed to. Not a very well-used law at all by any such imagination. But the really bigger question is, why would I give you immunity? And as a prosecutor, people ask all the time, the reason I would give immunity is if there is a bigger fish to fry that you can actually give me, or if what you're going to tell me, I can find nowhere else. So what he has to do first is tell the prosecutors, kind of off the record, what I'm offering here, why it's worth your while. And then if they decide that it is worth their while, guess who has to give immunity? It's not just the FBI, it's the Department of Justice, which means that Jeff Sessions' recusal now has monumental implications.
Let me ask you something. This is someone sent it to me, and I thought they made a very good point, Laura, and this is for you. And then I'll get to everyone else. And this is someone who was in the military, and he sent it to me, and they also sent it to my colleague Anderson. It says, my guess is that Lieutenant General Flynn will fully support and protect the Trump administration, fall on the sword, and even take some more blame with the Russians. I do believe he will ultimately float something esoteric, but with some news value and defaming about the Obama administration. What do you think of that? I found that email interesting.
It is interesting because his letter suggests that he wants vindication from the kind of, not only the witch hunt he's expecting, but one that he believes he was a victim to.
But would he fall on the sword for the entire Trump administration to make
I would not be shocked, because a lot of people nowadays seem to be willing to lose all their credibility for the administration. But
would
that's
the
a
FBI
possibility.
allow that if they know
No.
that going into it? No.
No,
Okay.
and the reason is because, first of all, I have to believe you as the FBI and the prosecutor that what you're trying to do is assist the investigation, not simply save your tail. And what you have to give me must be useful. Remember,
Okay.
if they can prosecute everyone, why would they exclude one? Unless that person has information, I can get nowhere
Gotcha.
else.
I got you. Okay. David Gergen. This is what General Flynn told Meet the Press last September about the Clinton campaign's legal issues. Listen to this.
The very last thing that John Podesta just said is no individual too big to jail. That should include people like Hillary Clinton. I mean, 5 people around her have been given immunity, to include her former chief of staff. When you are given immunity, that means that you've probably committed a crime.
Probably wishing he hadn't said that.
You think? Listen, it's deeply disturbing to have a president in the first 100 days to be embroiled in what may be a scandal. And increasingly, it appears that with General Flynn now saying he would come up he would testify if granted immunity, that really suggests very heavily there is indefinitely fire. And what we've been seeing over the last few weeks is a lot of attempts to cover up the fire with smoke. And we've seen a lot of different diversionary things. And I would say one thing about it. I would imagine the FBI and the Justice Department would wait on granting immunity done. Typically, what you want to do, as you know, in any criminal investigation, is to start way down the chain, people at the lowest level, and build up your evidentiary case. So you may give immunity to the lower level people so that you can go after the big fish. Michael Flynn is a big fish. He's not somewhere down here. He's up here as former national security advisor. We've never had a national security advisor accused of anything like this since John Poindexter way back in the Reagan years.
But usually they want a bigger fish, right?
Yeah,
Than
exactly.
the person that they're giving immunity to. Who's bigger than him?
Well, that's right. There are not only a couple of people in the United States, and one of them including the President of the United States, that you would think of. That's why I think they're going to build their case, more carefully and over time, and they may eventually give him immunity because they need it to go on. They have suspicions, but I think it's early.
So David's given us some perspective here. If I can go to my historian here, John, because you've dealt with Watergate. We keep bringing up Watergate. We don't know if there's anything here. No one has been prosecuted. No information has been found. But this is huge that he's asking for immunity. All the president's men, right? Right. What about that comparison? I mean, to put it in perspective, we're 70 days in, and we have the former national security advisor asking for immunity.
Yeah. When you write your presidential memoirs, this is not the way you want to lead. Your national security advisor asked for immunity before you hit day 100.
The one who the one who was fired.
The one who was fired, yeah. And I will say this. People were privately saying, both Republicans and Democrats in the transition, that while they were more impressed than they expected to be by Trump's appointments, Flynn was an exception to that. I suspect David heard a lot of this too. Former Republican cabinet members, former Democratic cabinet members, all were a little anxious about General Flynn. And so I think that, historical analogies here would be Iran-Contra, it would be Watergate, it would be, although there was not an investigation, it would be President Nixon, Vice President Nixon at the time, trying to influence the Vietnamese peace talks late in 1968, the 68 campaign. And what you often look for in these is the proffer. You look to see who's going to talk first. And this is what's interesting to me about this is usually at this point in one of these stories, you're still talking about the press uncovering things. You're talking about the prosecutorial machinery, the congressional machinery is not quite as far along. This is moving at a kind of warp speed. And I don't think it's just the news cycle. One other point, the most sulfurous conversations I've had with people who really support President Trump and those who don't, and I've witnessed them, is about this issue, is about the question of whether or not Russia was trying to explicitly help Trump and to what extent Trump himself might have known this. And I think that we're going to be entering a really interesting period in the next days and weeks, which is at what point will facts begin to shift opinion? Our opinions now are so impregnable sometimes, so resilient to contrary information. It's going to be interesting to see if Flynn has something to say that's undermining of the president. How much of Trump's base of support, 30, 35, 37% of the people who approve of what he's doing, how much will those people follow that? It's going to be very interesting to watch.
When will they start to believe facts and reality over ideology, which is the issue that we have been dealing with, Nia? And this is a difficult place for the White House to be right now. Jeff Zeleny said he asked Sean Spicer as he was leaving the White House tonight to respond. Sean said no. So how do you think they handled this?
Yeah, we'll have to see tomorrow at Jon Spicer's briefing how he handles it. I imagine he is thinking about how to approach this, and he's probably talking to his advisors about how to frame this tomorrow at that press briefing.
This doesn't help with the narrative that they've been given. Remember, the president said, you know, I would have told him to speak to these people. He was just doing his job.
Right. I mean, none of this is helpful. I mean, if you just think back a week ago, we were talking on this program about them pulling the health care bill, right? And now we're talking about Russia, and those two things aren't unrelated. They go to why this president isn't able to drive an agenda. They go to why this president isn't able to go on the offense in any sort of consistent way and have political capital and be able to use that political capital. And so here we have a president who's sitting at 35%, and there are partisan divides. As John was talking about. But here you have the specter of Michael Flynn, who in many ways was a darling of conservative, sort of the Breitbart audience, and people thought it was unfair that he was pushed out of the White House and it was the media's doing. So here we have the specter of him actually testifying possibly against this White House. And what does that do to those approval ratings? And what does that do to what has been this administration's stance on this story, which is probably there's nothing to see here, but also that this is fake news, right? That this is really a hoax. We saw the president tweet about that.
I remember
just days
thinking
ago.
that whole fake news thing when I had to come on the air and announce breaking news that Michael Flynn had resigned. In the back of my head, I kept saying, so much for fake news, so much for fake news, because all these things are happening. And when I had to say Jeff Sessions had to recuse himself, so much for fake news. And now you have Michael Flynn asking for immunity. And you forgot one thing. At 11 o'clock last night, our lead story was a travel ban. I mean, they had issues with that as well. So Matt Lewis, I'm going to give you the last word in this block, but what does this speak about the president's judgment on choosing advisors and the people around him?
Well, I think that it was Jon Meacham earlier. Someone was talking about how people were generally pretty happy with the advisors that Donald Trump picked. I would say pleasantly surprised, you know. He had some good people in there, but Michael Flynn was the one that I think, obviously very credentialed, obviously great military background, but you know, in the last couple of years, especially during the campaign with the "lock her up" chant and all of that,
he led those "lock her up" chant. I mean, this could be karma at its best.
Yeah, so ironic, right?
Yeah.
And the tweets, and he seemed to be unhinged, and
he was a birther.
Yeah, it seems like he was somebody that was sort of an accident waiting to happen, you know, and you know, you learn when you're a kid. Your parents tell you, like, be careful the people you hang around with. One does get the sense that Michael Flynn was a bad influence on that administration, and
or as the president says, a bad hombre. We'll continue.
One bad hombre.
We'll be right back. Our breaking news tonight, President Trump's former national security advisor, General Michael Flynn, breaking his silence, offering to testify before federal and congressional investigators, but only if he is granted immunity. It is the latest headache for a White House reeling from the unfolding Russia investigation. But how did we get here? Let's go back to the morning of March 4th, a Saturday at Mar-a-Lago. President Trump is angry and tweeting, quote, "Terrible. Just found out that Obama had my wires tapped in Trump Tower just before the victory. Nothing found. This is McCarthyism." And this. How low has President Obama gone to tap my phones during the very sacred election process? This is Nixon Watergate. Bad or sick guy. The president offering absolutely no evidence to back up his shocking accusation against former President Barack Obama. The White House in full spin mode for days, trying to defend the indefensible, and offering no evidence because there is none. But 11 days later, President Trump tells Fox's Tucker Carlson this.
I've been seeing a lot of things. Now, for the most part, I'm not going to discuss it because we have it before the committee, and we will be submitting things before the committee very soon. That hasn't been submitted as of yet. But wiretap covers a lot of different things. I think you're going to find some very interesting items coming to the forefront over the next 2 weeks.
And he was right, in a way. Some very interesting items are revealed on March 20th. FBI Director James Comey testifies publicly saying he has found no evidence to support the president's accusations, but even worse for the president, revealing that the FBI is investigating Russian interference in the 2016 election.
And that includes investigating the nature of any links between individuals associated with the Trump campaign and the Russian government, and whether there was any coordination between the campaign and Russia's efforts. As with any counterintelligence investigation, this will also include an assessment of whether any crimes were committed.
The next day, things get really interesting, and maybe this is what President Trump was suggesting to Tucker Carlson. House Intel Committee Chairman Devin Nunes, who was a member of the Trump transition team, makes a secret trip to the White House grounds where he's led into a secure room and given information he claims suggests that Trump team communications may have been swept up in surveillance of foreign nationals. The big question, by whom? Nunes holds a news conference the next day, then rushes to the White House to brief the president, and later cancels all hearings. President Trump claims the newly revealed information vindicates him, which it didn't at all.
Do you feel vindicated by Chairman Nunes?
I somewhat do. I must tell you, I somewhat do. I very much appreciated the fact that they found what they found, but I somewhat do.
But the next day, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer faces tough questions about the source or sources of that information.
So will you rule out that the White House or anyone in the Trump administration gave Chairman Nunes that information?
I did not sit on that briefing. I'm not, it just doesn't, so I don't know why he would brief the speaker and then come down here to brief us on something that we would have briefed him on. It doesn't really seem to make a ton of sense. So I'm not aware of it, but it doesn't really pass the smell test.
Does that pass your smell test? Well, today, the New York Times reports that 2 White House officials helped give Nunes those reports. Back with my panel. David Gergen, you first. You heard the timeline from the first tweets from President Trump accusing President Obama to what we're learning about today. Is this a cover-up, you think?
Don, you know, if you've been sitting there in the White House and trying to plan out a way to convince the public that you've done something, you've been up to no good, and you're going to invent a cover-up to cover for it, you couldn't come up with a better way to do this than what they've done. I mean, it's just astonishing. They could have, in so many ways, done things, and there may be a lot of innocence here, but they've done things in such a surreptitious, suspicious way that they're natural questions about, well, why the hell would you go in there? Why did you guys lie about it when it was over? Why wasn't Sean Spicer given the truth?
Well, what was interesting to me is that maybe there's nothing there.
Maybe. For the country's sake, you'd like
for the country's sake, it would be, if nothing was there, right? It would be for the good of the country. But the cover-up is always worse than the crime. Like if you're covering up for Devin Nunes and you're getting information, that's a lie. Then, you know, I'm not saying that they have lied to the FBI, but that's usually what happens. You end up lying to investigators, and then you end up getting yourself in trouble. And that's what it looks like, that there's some cover-up there. Even though nothing may be there.
This has to be one of the clumsiest cover-ups in history. But even so, you cannot escape the feeling that there's something more there, that there is a fire, and we need to know. And thank goodness the Senate's going to be in there with a serious investigation, along with the FBI.
Jon Meacham, does this pass your smell test?
Well, just to disagree with you slightly, with great respect.
That's fine. Go on.
The cover-up isn't always worse than the crime, actually. You know, there could be some pretty serious underlying crimes here. Vice President Cheney said, you know, Russia trying to influence the election could be considered an act of war. That's Dick Cheney. Let me let that sink in for a second. So I think that I don't think we know. I think, and to use another figure from the Ford Bush 43 years, Donald Rumsfeld, who said we have known unknowns. Right now, it's a known unknown.
You're pulling out your entire arsenal, aren't you?
It's all here, baby. It's all here. So I think that we don't know exactly what it is here. But I would suggest this, that and David has worked in several White Houses and can disagree if he disagrees, but the character of the president is determinative, and I would argue that from everything we know about Donald Trump, he's conspiratorially minded. The notion of truth is not something with which he's intimately familiar. What he says in 1 hour, he will say the opposite in the next hour. He lives very much in the moment. And I'm wondering if what we're seeing with the Nunes drama and with what may or may not appear at this point to be a cover-up is a reflection of the president living in this kind of conspiratorial universe where all they really understand is you punch back. And the Nunes business may have been a punch back. We're just not sure what's behind them altogether.
Yeah, far be it from me to disagree with the historian on our panel, so I won't. I'll let that stand.
Can I just say though, Don, punch back, if a punch back is sending out a tweet or attacking somebody rhetorically from a podium, then that's one thing. But if a punch back involves manipulating a chairman of a committee and entering into this sort of facade, going over to the White House, then all of a sudden now you're a pawn in this game, and that could take on some very serious ramifications. He would be basically a patsy is what Nunes would be in this scenario.
Yeah, I think, let me just say, I think Jon Meacham is on to something important. It may well be, and people in his district think Mr. Nunes is a man of great character. It may be, well, they're absolutely right. You can get swept into a White House net and pulled in, sucked in ways that innocent people get really hurt very fast.
Yeah. Hold your thoughts. We'll be right back. Here's our breaking news tonight. General Michael Flynn, President Trump's former national security advisor, offering to testify in exchange for immunity. Meanwhile, the Senate Intelligence Committee holding its first public hearing today into Russian meddling in the election. Let's discuss now with my panel. They are back. So, Nia, some of the big moments from one of the Senate Intelligence hearing on Russian meddling in the election and possible collusion with the Trump campaign. Look at this.
Our community has been a target of Russian information warfare, propaganda, and cyber campaigns, and still is.
Russia's overt media outlets and covert trolls sought to sideline opponents on both sides of the political spectrum with adversarial views towards the Kremlin. They were in full swing during both the Republican and Democratic primary season and may have helped sink the hopes of candidates more hostile to Russian interests long before the field narrowed.
This is not fake news. This is actually what happened to us.
Nia, what's your reaction?
No, I mean, it was a powerful committee hearing today. All of these revelations about Russia, Rubio revealing that he had been hacked as well, this idea that all along they had been playing this game of favorites and sinking candidates that they viewed as not being favorable to them. There had been so much concern, right, about this House Intelligence Committee taken over by Nunes and seeming to lack all credibility at this point. And I think this eased some concerns. The Senate Intelligence Committee there with those opening statements from Richard Burr and then Mark Warner, Senator Mark Warner, talking about this being a nonpartisan investigation. They want to follow the evidence where it leads, and we'll just have to see. This is very early in this process. They've got many more witnesses. I think the witness list is something like 20, but my goodness, so disturbing to hear today about Russia's involvement in this idea that this happened to us, right? That is what Mark Warner said, and I think that's the focus of this Senate Intelligence Committee wants to have, that it's not a partisan fight.
So, Juliet, can I ask you something? If Flynn wants immunity and he testifies, FBI, obviously that would not be public. The Senate, that wouldn't be a public hearing, would it?
Oh, I think it would be.
Would.
I mean, I think that the Senate would want it to be, and it may be that Flynn actually wants it to be. His lawyer released a statement today, so I would suspect whatever story he does have to tell, he would want it to be public. Can
you imagine the entire country, the entire world sitting there watching him testify? I know. And it's, I'm just going to take a step back here for a minute and just how deeply disturbing today is.
because I think we tend to forget it on sort of, what leak and who knew what when, and does this get to the White House or to Donald Trump himself. This is not a foreign policy or an international crisis. And while this is happening in the United States, North Korea, China, Russia, famine in Africa, hurricanes and storms here, terrorism and ISIS, Iraq, more troops, Syria. I'm gonna forget the rest of the list. The world is threatening to us, and we have not talked about policy since this administration began, and we have certainly not talked about foreign policy. That is something that sort of chokes me up because I just find it so tiresome that this administration cannot either face the truth or, worse, that the truth is as bad as some of us fear.
Interesting perspective. Laura, Senator Mark Warner says the goal of the hearing was to determine if there was any actual fire, but so far there's a great deal of smoke, he says. Given the testimony that we heard today, do you see fire?
Yes, but I see fire in a way that people don't consider, and that is circumstantial evidence does carry a great deal of weight. And I know there may not be a smoking gun, there may not be a source of this actual flame, but that's going to be one of the reasons why someone like Michael Flynn's testimony may indeed be very useful to the investigation, because it may be about placing certain people together or getting certain facts together in a circumstantial way that will lead you to conclude the obvious, whatever that may be ultimately. So what this tells me is that we actually may be having an investigation. Remember, this all comes down to one thing. We are presuming that there is, in fact, a collusion, perhaps, but the investigation has to actually take place. But what cannot happen is a premature undermining of that investigation. It would be a great thing if General Flynn was in a position to actually give information that the FBI does not already know, or that would help the Senate or the House not only restore its credibility, but also illuminate an issue that we do not know much about at this point. But it's absolutely true. This is very, very disturbing. But one of the things that is very obvious to me is that we aren't discussing foreign policy because so far the policy has been that a foreign government has perhaps interfered, and that has to take precedence in many respects.
Do we have time for Clinton Watts? Yes. I'm going to play this. Okay. The national security expert Clinton Watts giving chilling testimony about tracing Russian influence. Listen to this.
Follow the trail of dead Russians. There's been more dead Russians in the past 3 months that are tied to this investigation, who have assets in banks all over the world. They are dropping dead even in Western countries.
John, really chilling. Can we make that connection, though?
Well, I mean, look, Putin is not what we would call good news, unquestionably. And there have been reports of a long-standing, decade-long or more, foreign intelligence operation to influence the politics of other nations. He's playing a kind of pre-Cold War great game. He wants spheres of influence. He wants energy-rich countries. He is willing to do almost anything to contain the opposition at home and to exert his influence abroad. And I think to some extent, we may even be underplaying this. Mitt Romney was ahead of the curve. Remember, people mocked him
yeah, indeed
5
they
years
did.
ago,
right,
when he said that Russia was our most significant geopolitical threat, and it may well be. So, so I think that these questions are important, they're urgent, and I go back to what Vice President Cheney said, and I mean it quite seriously. He believes that this could be at the level of an act of war, of a foreign power interfering with our politics.
People, we often tend to romanticize the past, but that's not romanticism there. That was the truth. He actually did say that. I know you want to weigh in, but I want to get this question in, David. Because Watts also testified that Vladimir Putin's government uses an army of paid internet trolls. They spread fake news online. He says that they tweet conspiracy theories at President Trump when they believe he is active on Twitter, with the goal being there to create distrust among Americans and our allies. Is that a new theory in terms of them trying to directly influence the president on Twitter? First, Matt, and then David, you weigh in. Matt?
Yeah, I haven't heard of this before, and I think partly because we've never had a president who was so vulnerable to taking the bait before. This is a pretty smart idea, because Donald Trump might just retweet something that could start a firestorm. And so I think that's very shrewd of them. It sounds very sneaky and clever. I also just want to say, anecdotally speaking, that during the campaign, I was inundated by tweets from trolls, and I thought it was the alt-right. There would be the Pepe the Frog thing, and people calling me names and attacking me if I said anything critical about Donald Trump, especially in the primary. And Don, a funny thing happened. As soon as the election was over, all those people went away.
Isn't that amazing?
It's
I would
really
look at my
interesting.
feed and say, this has to be bots.
I think they're now focused in France.
David Gergen, what do you think? And also, I think it's interesting too, the Marco Rubio stuff as well, saying that he was victimized by hacks multiple times.
Absolutely, and as recently as just the last few days. Listen, the attempts to influence elections in other countries, the Russians have been up to this ever since the end of the Second World War. And truth be known, the United States did it too, especially in Europe. We wanted to make sure countries didn't go communist, and we got involved and poured some money in surreptitiously through the CIA. So this is old. But what's new about this is the internet and the capacity for social media to invent stories and spread them very, very quickly and influence things. And I do think it's quite serious. And I have to tell you, Don, in contrast to the House Intelligence Committee, which really has botched everything, and there's almost a sense that Nunes, the chairman, tried to sabotage the committee because it's now completely compromised. I don't know where it goes from here, even though there's some good people. By contrast, the Senate committee looks very promising. There's some serious people who are conducting this, and today's hearings are important because they laid a foundation for understanding. Here's what the Russians are up to. Let's understand that before we turn to the question of collusion of America.
And how might the Senate be different? We'll discuss that when we come right back.
Good.
Our breaking news, former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn willing to testify before federal and congressional investigators, but only if he is granted immunity. I'm back now with my panel. What do you think? Do you think, Jon Meacham, do you think Nunes lasts on this committee?
I don't think so, and I think that it's an easy way for the Republican leadership to show that they're being responsive to what's a growing and very uncomfortable story.
Yeah, David Gergen, you think he lasts?
No.
That's
you said you wanted the lightning
simple
round.
and concise. I wanted a lightning round. What do you think, Nia?
Yeah, probably not. I mean, if you see what's happening here, the Senate is essentially maligning the House as it goes. Senate Republicans are essentially talking trash about the House, and you imagine that somebody's going to step in and ask Nunes to step aside and recuse himself. So we'll have to see what happens over the next couple of days.
And that would have to be Paul Ryan, Juliet, if that happens.
It would Paul Ryan can show a backbone right now and do it. And I'll tell you why he should do it also, not just for the hearing. Other Republicans on the Intelligence Committee are being brought down by Nunes, and I suspect they don't like it very much either. Yeah. So it's be smart, political, and the right thing for Paul Ryan to just yank him.
Will that happen, Matt Lewis?
I think it might, and here's the reason. According to Paul Ryan today, Nunes did not tell him that the information came from the White House, but that it came from a, quote, whistleblower type person. And so maybe he's misleading the Speaker of the House.
Laura?
Every day that Nunes refuses to provide the information to his committee is every day that the committee loses its credibility indefinitely.
Is there any recourse for that, for if you are not, if you tell things that are infactual, or if you lie? If you lie, does Nunes face anything?
Well, you can lie to the media, but you can't lie under oath, and you can't lie to the FBI. If that's what he's doing by withholding information or trying to mislead or undermine, then there will be criminal consequences, I'm sure.
I want to ask you, John, do you think that the president is starting to change his tune on Russia now, or is this going to force him to do that?
That's the thing to watch, right? I don't think he is right now. I think that one of the things that has kept this going, we've used the fire analogy a lot. One of the things that's blown a lot of oxygen into this is this remarkable spirit of generosity that Donald Trump has expressed toward Russia. Mm-hmm. And you can argue maybe that this is his one great Kissinger-Nixon insight, that he wants some great geopolitical balance, but that would be the one. And so I think that one of the things that has kept this going is, why does President Trump continue to appear to give Vladimir Putin the benefit of the doubt at every turn.
Yeah, David, I asked that because sources say President Trump believes the current atmosphere with ongoing probes into to Trump-Russia-Putin ties and the election meddling, it's going to make it impossible for him to make a deal. This is the first time we've heard something like that from this president.
He's right. He's right. Listen, but it's of his own doing. I mean, we wouldn't be here trying to discuss all this had he shown the same sort of respect toward Russia he does toward China. Now he's skeptical about some aspects of the relationship.
But what's interesting to me, everyone, is that this is when he said it's of his own doing. The Nunezing may not have happened. A lot of this may not have happened if not for that Saturday morning tweet, those tweets about the former president. This was a completely self-inflicted wound.
I totally agree with that. And we've been off on a wild goose chase here for a long time. But it's also important to remember the FBI investigation began before that tweet, that there's something more serious underneath all this.
Thank you. You're an amazing panel. I really appreciate you guys joining me for the entire hour. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
you.
Don.